September 17th, 2014. The state of Texas carried out the execution of Lisa Ann Coleman. She was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. inside the death chamber of the Huntsville unit. Coleman was 38 years old, and her execution made her only the 9th woman put to death in Texas since the Civil War. Her crime dated back to 2004 in Arlington, Texas, where 9-year-old Davontae Williams was found dead inside an apartment he shared with his mother, Ann Coleman. Prosecutors described his death as the result of prolonged abuse and starvation. The autopsy revealed that the boy weighed only 35 pounds, less than half the average weight for his age. Coleman's case would shock the state and draw national headlines. Supporters of the prosecution pointed to the severity of the abuse as justification for the death sentence. But critics of capital punishment saw her case as an example of the system's harshest judgment, raising questions about whether her troubled upbringing and mental health struggles were ever fully considered. From the moment of her sentencing to her final hours, Lisa Ann Coleman's story stood at the intersection of justice, punishment, and debate. It was a case that forced Texas, and the nation, to confront difficult questions about crime, accountability, and the death penalty itself. On July 26, 2004, paramedics and Arlington police responded to an emergency call at the apartment of Marcella Williams and Lisa Ann Coleman. Inside, they discovered the body of 9-year-old Davontae Williams. He was severely emaciated, weighing only 36 pounds, the average weight of a healthy 4-year-old. His ribs, arms, and legs were visibly wasted. The medical examiner later determined that Davontae had died from malnutrition, complicated by pneumonia. Autopsy reports and court records described injuries consistent with prolonged abuse and neglect. Davontae had scars and evidence that suggested he had been restrained. Testimony at trial revealed that he was often confined inside a closet or small room, deprived of food, and kept away from other people. Neighbors later told investigators they rarely saw Davontae outside the apartment. Records showed that Child Protective Services had previously removed him from his mother's care, but he had been returned. By 2004, the abuse had escalated to what prosecutors would describe as torture. When questioned, Lisa Ann Coleman denied responsibility. But prosecutors presented evidence that she lived in the apartment and actively participated in the discipline and confinement of Davontae alongside Marcella Williams. The state argued that Coleman's role went beyond neglect, that she intentionally starved and mistreated the boy, leading to his death. For investigators, the discovery was devastating. One detective later called it one of the worst cases of child abuse he had ever seen. What began as a welfare call had become a homicide investigation, a case that would eventually lead Texas to seek the ultimate punishment. The investigation into the death of 9-year-old Davontae Williams moved quickly. Arlington police focused immediately on the adults inside the apartment. Marcella Williams, his mother, and her partner, Lisa Ann Coleman. The medical examiner confirmed that Davontae had died from malnutrition, with pneumonia listed as a contributing factor. At just 36 pounds, his condition was described by prosecutors as the result of months of deliberate starvation. When officers searched the apartment, they found evidence that Davontae had been confined inside a closet. Testimony later revealed that he was locked away for long periods and denied food. Autopsy findings of scars and marks on his body suggested a pattern of abuse and restraint. Child Protective Services records showed that Davontae had previously been removed from his mother's care due to abuse concerns but was eventually returned. Investigators used this history to establish that neglect and mistreatment had been part of his life long before the summer of 2004. Interviews with neighbors added to the disturbing picture. Several said they rarely, if ever, saw Davontae outside the apartment. To police, this supported the evidence that he had been hidden from view, isolated and deprived of normal childhood experiences. As the case unfolded, investigators built their theory of shared responsibility. While Marcella Williams was Davontae's mother, authorities determined that Lisa Ann Coleman had actively participated in disciplining and controlling him. Both women were charged with capital murder. From the outset, police and prosecutors made it clear they did not see Davontae's death as an accident or simple neglect. To them, the evidence showed a sustained and intentional pattern of abuse, choices that led directly to the boy's death. In March of 2006, the capital murder trial of Lisa Ann Coleman began in Fort Worth, Texas. From the outset, jurors were confronted with the harrowing details of 9-year-old Davontae Williams' death. Prosecutors laid out stark facts. At nearly 10 years old, Davontae weighed only 36 pounds, about the average weight of a healthy 4-year-old. The medical examiner testified that he died from malnutrition, with pneumonia listed as a contributing factor. His emaciated frame and the marks on his body told a story of long-term abuse and neglect. The state argued this was not an accident, nor a case of momentary negligence. They described a sustained pattern of cruelty. Jurors were shown evidence that Davontae had been confined inside a closet-like pantry, hidden from neighbors and visitors. Food, prosecutors said, had been deliberately withheld as punishment. Witnesses testified that the boy was rarely seen outside, living instead in isolation that grew more severe over time. To the prosecution, Lisa Ann Coleman was not a bystander. They argued she acted alongside Marcella Williams, Davontae's mother, in controlling, disciplining, and ultimately starving the child. They painted a picture of a household where cruelty was systematic, calling Davontae's death a slow form of torture. The defense, however, urged jurors to see Coleman through a different lens. Her attorneys pointed to her own background, a childhood marked by abuse and instability, and argued that she was not the primary caregiver. They stressed that Marcella Williams, as Davontae's mother, bore the ultimate responsibility for his welfare. Coleman's lawyers asked the jury to spare her life, suggesting that she should receive life in prison rather than a death sentence. As the trial continued, testimony became graphic. Jurors heard about scars and injuries on Davontae's body, wounds consistent with abuse and prolonged mistreatment. Expert witnesses explained how starvation progresses, how the body weakens over weeks and months without nourishment, and how Davontae's condition could only have been the result of extended deprivation. Prosecutors emphasized that this was intentional conduct. They told jurors that Coleman and Williams acted together, that their choices were deliberate, and that Davontae's suffering was not the result of neglect, but of willful cruelty. When the jury retired to deliberate, the evidence weighed heavily. They found Lisa Ann Coleman guilty of capital murder. She was just 30 years old. In the punishment phase, prosecutors argued that the crime, the prolonged starvation of a child, warranted the ultimate penalty. The defense pleaded for mercy, reminding jurors of Coleman's traumatic past and the possibility of redemption behind bars. After careful consideration, the jury returned its decision: death. Lisa Ann Coleman was formally sentenced to die by lethal injection. With that verdict, she became only the 10th woman on Texas's death row in the modern era. Part of a small and grimly unique group, her sentence would launch nearly a decade of appeals, during which her case became a focal point in the ongoing debate about women, justice, and capital punishment. After her 2006 conviction, Lisa Ann Coleman was transferred to Texas's death row for women at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. The prison, surrounded by razor wire and farmland, houses all of Texas's female inmates under sentence of death. At the time, fewer than a dozen women in the entire state were facing the death penalty. A small fraction compared to the hundreds of men confined on death row in Texas. For the next 8 years, Coleman's case moved through the courts. Her attorneys raised multiple arguments on appeal. They contended that her childhood, marked by physical abuse, neglect, and time in foster care, should have carried more weight with jurors. They also challenged the state's use of the law of parties, a statute that allows prosecutors to seek the death penalty against someone even if they did not inflict the fatal act themselves, as long as they were found to have participated in the crime. Coleman's lawyers argued that the law blurred individual responsibility and made her sentence disproportionate. But Texas courts rejected each appeal. In 2014, her legal team made a final plea to the United States Supreme Court, asking the justices to intervene. That request was denied. The execution date was set. As September 17th approached, Coleman's case drew renewed attention from both domestic and international media. Reporters highlighted the extraordinary rarity of women being executed in the United States. According to the Associated Press, she would become only the 9th woman put to death in Texas since the state resumed executions in 1982, and the 15th nationwide since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. Advocates against the death penalty pointed to those numbers as evidence of how unusual her execution would be. Supporters of capital punishment, however, argued that her gender should not shield her from the same consequences imposed on men. On the day of her scheduled execution, Coleman was transported from Mountain View to the Huntsville unit, known as the Walls Unit, the location where Texas carries out all of its executions. In the hours before she was led into the chamber, she was permitted to meet with a spiritual advisor and speak with family members by phone. At 6 p.m., she was escorted into the small room that houses Texas's gurney. Behind the glass partition, witnesses gathered, reporters, officials, and family members of both Coleman and her victim, Davontae Williams. Strapped to the gurney, Coleman appeared calm. When asked if she had a final statement, she looked toward her loved ones and said she loved them. She added softly, "I'm all right." She did not proclaim innocence, nor did she offer an apology, leaving her last words brief and understated. At 6:24 p.m., the warden signaled for the execution to begin. A lethal dose of pentobarbital was injected into her veins. Witnesses reported that Coleman took a final deep breath, her chest rising and falling once before her body grew still. She was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. She was 38 years old. Outside the prison, reactions were divided. Some of Davontae's relatives expressed relief that justice had finally been served for the boy who had suffered so greatly. For them, the execution marked a form of closure after more than a decade of court proceedings. But abolitionists and human rights advocates mourned what they saw as another failure of mercy. Groups such as Amnesty International criticized the state of Texas, arguing that the death penalty does not heal the wounds of victims' families and remains applied unevenly. Lisa Ann Coleman's execution closed one of Texas's most disturbing criminal cases, the starvation death of a 9-year-old child hidden in plain sight. Yet it also reignited debates that continue to this day, about the role of the law of parties in capital punishment, about the treatment of women on death row, and about whether the death penalty itself has a place in a modern justice system. Her death on September 17, 2014, became both an ending and a beginning, the end of Coleman's long legal battle and the continuation of a larger conversation about justice, punishment, and the cost of the ultimate penalty. The execution of Lisa Ann Coleman in 2014 left behind more than the memory of a crime. It reopened conversations about justice, punishment, and mercy in Texas and across the nation. Coleman was only the 9th woman executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982, and the 15th woman executed in the entire United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. The rarity of her case drew international attention. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International, condemned the execution and pointed to what they called the arbitrariness of sentencing women to death. Supporters of the punishment saw it differently. To prosecutors and state officials, Coleman's case demonstrated that the law did not distinguish between male and female defendants. They argued that her sentence reflected the extreme cruelty of the crime, the prolonged starvation of 9-year-old Davontae Williams, and that such brutality demanded the harshest penalty available under Texas law. For death penalty opponents, her case became part of a broader debate. They raised concerns familiar in Texas capital cases, whether juries give sufficient weight to a defendant's history of abuse and neglect, whether legal representation in capital trials is effective, and whether life without parole could provide justice without taking another life. Since her death, Coleman's name has remained on a short and controversial list, one that underscores both Texas's leading role in executions and the ongoing debate about how and against whom the death penalty is applied. For some, her execution is remembered as justice for a child whose life was cut short in suffering. For others, it stands as a reminder of a system that delivers death in ways that continue to divide public conscience. In the end, Lisa Ann Coleman's legacy is inseparable from the questions her case raises about crime, punishment, and the meaning of justice in Texas. This case still raises so many questions. Do you think this was a crime of cruelty or a desperate act of a troubled mind? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories every week.